In a world drawing its final ragged breath, the Empire was a corpse held together by rust and cruelty. Its fractured territories had become the personal fiefdoms of brutal warlords, while in the shadowed alleys of its decaying cities, twisted guilds practiced arts that should have remained buried in forgotten tombs. Here, the profane science of bioengineering was not merely a tool, but a faith, its tenets entwined with ancient curses that bled into the very soil, poisoning the heart of all things. Power, raw and absolute, was the only currency worth possessing, and its sole source was a force known as essence, a volatile, living energy that pulsed in the marrow of every living thing. To manipulate it was to dance on the edge of godhood, a perilous privilege reserved for those with the purest bloodlines, or for those desperate enough to forge unholy pacts with arcane symbionts. Only the rarest few, the chosen of genetics, possessed the key to unlock its deepest secrets. For all others, to touch its untamed power was to invite a grotesque transformation, a spiraling descent into monstrosity where the memory of one's humanity was the first and most terrible price paid. This was the world that had forgotten the name Kael, and it had done so with good reason. His name was a synonym for weakness, a bitter jest whispered in the barracks of the forsaken borderlands, where life was cheaper than water. He was a soldier, but only in title, a frail, disposable pawn on a board of endless grinding conflict. Scorned for his meager build and a complete, almost defiant absence of talent, his life had been a litany of quiet humiliations, each one a stone laid upon the silent, hardening rage behind his eyes. Kael's world, already a cage forged from shame and inadequacy, was about to be shattered completely. The betrayal, when it came, was not delivered by an enemy's blade, but by the cold, dismissive eyes of his own commanders. After a disastrous skirmish in the Crimson Wastes, where his unit was systematically decimated due to flawed intelligence, a scapegoat was required to absorb the fault. Kael, the perpetual failure, the boy who always looked down, was the perfect offering. He was not court-martialed. He was not executed. His sentence was a fate far more insidious. He was condemned to a clandestine program, a place spoken of only in hushed, terrified whispers. Project Chimera. He was dragged away in chains of cold iron, the mockery of his comrades echoing in his ears, a final ringing testament to his perceived worthlessness. The transport was a suffocating metal box, a coffin on wheels, hurtling him toward an unknown and absolute darkness. There, in the sterile white hell of a hidden laboratory that smelled of ozone and antiseptic, he endured an agony that transcended the known lexicon of pain. He was no longer a man. He was raw material, a canvas of flesh upon which nightmares would be painted. Fused with strains of cursed essence, a volatile cocktail of forbidden life force, and subjected to the profane scalpels of raw bioengineering, his body became a crucible of torment. Every cell screamed as it was torn apart and forcibly rewritten by an alien will. Yet, through the gray, shimmering haze of unending torment, something within him, something forged in the fires of a lifetime of indignity, refused to break. The unyielding will, the silent defiance he had nurtured in the dark, surged. The rage he had swallowed for years, a quiet, bitter ember, began to simmer, then to boil, and finally to roar into an infernal blaze. It was fueled by a single searing desire that burned away all other thoughts, to make them all pay. The experiment was designed to forge the ultimate living weapon, a being of unparalleled power, bound by absolute obedience to its creators. But they had made a single fatal miscalculation. They had measured his physical frailty, his lack of essence, his every tangible weakness, but they had failed to quantify the sheer, adamantine strength of his hatred. As the final phase of the procedure began, flooding his system with a cataclysmic dose of unstable essence, the facility's arcane reactors began to scream. Alarms blared, a frantic, discordant symphony heralding imminent doom. A catastrophic malfunction, a cascade of failures, rippled through the system like a shock wave. The containment fields that held reality at bay flickered, buckled, and then shattered. The very energy meant to forge him into a slave was unleashed in a torrent of unrestrained creation and destruction. Instead of being annihilated by the surge, Kael's tormented body did the impossible. It became a void, a ravenous singularity of biological hunger. In one terrifying, agonizing instant that stretched into an eternity, he absorbed it all. The cursed essence, the volatile bioagents, the raw, chaotic energy of the meltdown itself. An uncontrollable metamorphosis was triggered, a chain reaction of cellular evolution that elevated him beyond any known human limit. His blood, once thin and weak, began to boil, transforming into a swirling vortex of living, destructive power. A wave of incandescent energy erupted from his body, a silent, blinding flash that vaporized everything in its path. The laboratory, the scientists, his tormentors, the entire secret faction that had conceived of this horror, all were erased from existence in a heartbeat of pure light. He was free, reborn in a baptism of atomic fire. But the boy named Kael was gone, his identity incinerated in the blast. What stood in the glowing, glass-lined crater, steam rising from its newly forged flesh, was something else entirely. Something new, something hungry, and something utterly, terrifyingly unstoppable. His first moments of consciousness were a sensory nightmare, a cacophony of information that threatened to tear his new mind apart. The world, once a dull and muted place, was now a screaming symphony of life and energy. He could feel the stubborn life force of the hardy desert scrubs pushing through the irradiated soil 100 yards away, their green pulse a timid whisper against his awareness. He could taste the metallic tang of ozone in the air, a ghost of the fire that had given him birth. He looked at his hands, no longer thin and scarred from a life of menial labor, but pale, perfect, and humming with a terrifying, contained power that felt like a coiled serpent beneath his skin. A new knowledge bloomed in his mind, not a memory learned, but an instinct awakened. It called itself the biological ascendance, an ancient and horrifying art of self-evolution, a power so profane it had been systematically erased from every known history and scripture. It was not magic he could cast, or a spell he could learn. It was an organic, self-evolving engine woven into the very fabric of his DNA. It whispered to him of its singular, relentless function, to assimilate essence from any living organism, and even from the environment itself, in order to rewrite his genetic code in real time, to adapt, to overcome, to become. He could feel it now, a gnawing emptiness in the core of his being, a hunger that was more than physical, more than emotional. It was an existential craving. His body, his very soul, craved essence. Stumbling through the skeletal ruins of his prison, he saw a desert lizard, a creature grotesquely mutated by the ambient waste of the Empire's endless wars. Without thinking, without conscious volition, his hand shot out. A tendril of black, shimmering energy, like liquid night, lashed from his fingertips and enveloped the creature. The lizard convulsed for a silent, terrible moment, and then dissolved into fine gray dust, its life force flooding into him like a cool, clean river into a parched desert. The wound on his side, a gaping, cauterized hole from the final explosive moments of the experiment, sealed over in an instant. Flesh and skin, muscle and sinew wove themselves back together with a grotesque, visible speed. He had gained impossibly adaptive combat abilities, a regenerative power that mocked the very concept of death, and the latent potential for monstrous new forms, limited only by his imagination and his will. But with that intoxicating surge of power, he felt a chilling drain, a cold leeching at the edges of his mind. The ascendance was feeding. It was feeding on his sanity, on the fragile tapestry of his memories, on his very lifespan. He was walking on a razor's edge, a path that led to godhood at one precipice and absolute, soul-shattering extinction at the other. And every single step forward was a step away from the man he used to be. The world did not remain ignorant of his violent birth for long. The obliteration of a top-secret, high-value facility sent shockwaves through the Empire's shadowy corridors of power. An asset had been lost. A monumental investment had turned rogue. The first to find him were not soldiers, but a specialized team of cleaners from the Iron Hand Guild, the very faction that had funded and overseen Project Chimera. They were bio-augmented hunters, their eyes glowing with the cold light of chemical enhancements, their senses honed to track the unique signature of aberrant essence that now bled from Kael like an open wound. They found him in the ruins of a border town he had stumbled into, a ghost haunting its dusty, windswept streets. They saw not a man, but a prize, a living, breathing specimen of the very power they sought to control, and they would bring it back in pieces if necessary. The confrontation was brutal and blessedly swift. They moved with the lethal, synchronized precision of a predator pack, a whirlwind of polished steel and alchemical weaponry. But they were fighting something that learned faster than they could adapt, something that evolved between one heartbeat and the next. Kael was clumsy at first, his movements raw and instinctual, driven by the primal directives of his new biology. A plasma blade, humming with contained heat, sliced deep into his shoulder. Before the hunter could retract the weapon, Kael's flesh convulsed, tendrils of living muscle seizing the superheated blade, pulling the shocked man with inhuman strength. Kael's other hand, now tipped with sharpened bone claws that had erupted from his knuckles in a spray of blood, plunged into the man's chest. He felt the hunter's essence, a potent, fiery energy, flood into him like a drug. The gaping wound on his shoulder sizzled, smoked, and closed. But it was more than just life force he absorbed. The knowledge of the hunter's combat style, the memory of his training, the finely honed edge of his reflexes, it all poured into Kael's mind in a disorienting, exhilarating rush. He began to move differently, his posture shifting, his steps becoming more certain. He started to predict their attacks, countering with a terrifying fusion of their own martial arts and his own monstrous, burgeoning strength. One by one, they fell. He did not just defeat them, he consumed them, assimilating their strength, their skills, their very life. When it was over, he stood in a circle of desiccated husks that crumbled into ash on the desert wind. He had won his first real battle, but the victory felt like a violation. With each life he took, the hunger screamed louder, and the face of the boy he once was grew fainter and more distorted in the mirror of his soul. Shaken and disoriented, Kael fled into the skeletal remains of the ashen forests, a petrified woodland cursed by the fallout of an ancient magical war, where the very air was thick with sorrow. He needed to understand the monster he was becoming, to find some way to control the storm raging within him. The whispers of the biological ascendants grew clearer in the profound silence of the dead woods. A sibilant, seductive voice carried on his own blood. It showed him visions, possibilities of what he could become. It urged him to devour, to evolve, to grow stronger without limit. He resisted at first, desperately trying to cling to the tattered remnants of his morality, the ghost of the man who had been too weak to even contemplate such violence. But survival was a ruthless and effective teacher. A grievous wound from a territorial cursed beast, a creature of shadow and teeth, forced his hand. He laid a trembling hand on the petrified bark of an ancient, colossal tree and felt the faint, dormant essence sleeping within its stone-like core. He drew it out, a slow, agonizing process like drinking from a dry well. The wood around his hand crumbled to fine dust as his wound slowly, painfully began to knit itself shut. It was a revelation. He could sustain himself on the world itself. But the process was slow, inefficient, offering mere sustenance instead of evolution. The system, the hunger, craved potent, living essence. It was during this desperate time of self-imposed exile that he found her. Ilara, a rogue scholar, an outcast from the Imperial Academy for her obsessive research into forbidden histories. She had been tracking the massive energy signature from the lab's destruction, believing it to be a sign of a world-changing event, a crack in the fabric of known reality. She found Kael not with fear, but with a breathtaking, terrifying awe. She saw the swirling, bioluminescent patterns that now faintly glowed on his skin under the dim light, recognizing them from fragmented, heretical texts describing the dawn of life itself. An uneasy alliance was forged in the heart of the cursed forest. He offered her protection from the myriad dangers of the wilds. She, in turn, offered him the one thing he desperately needed: knowledge. She translated the silent, instinctual language of his power, explaining its terrible, immutable cost. The Ascendance doesn't just grant power, she whispered one night by a meager fire, her eyes wide with academic fervor as she studied his regenerating flesh. It rewrites reality with you as its focal point. But every edit, every change requires fuel. It's burning your soul as a catalyst. He learned, through her painstaking research, that his own lifespan was the primary fuel source for this terrible engine. Every act of immense power, every rapid evolution he underwent, was shaving years, perhaps decades, off his life. He could replenish it, even extend it, by assimilating the lifespans of others, but that was a monstrous path he still feared to walk. The choice was stark and absolute: fade into nothingness as his power consumed him from within, or embrace the predator he was becoming and feast upon the world to survive. The news of the cleaners' utter failure reached the ears of their master, a man who sat at the apex of the Empire's shadow food chain. Warlord Valerius, the sovereign of scars, leader of the Iron Hand Guild, and the cold, brilliant architect behind Project Chimera. He was a man who had carved his own flesh into a living weapon, a monument to his own ambition built upon a mountain of countless sacrifices. He stood in his obsidian throne room, the walls lined with failed experiments floating in preservation tanks like grotesque works of art, and listened to the report. His face, a tapestry of ritualistic scars and gleaming biomechanical implants, showed no emotion. But the very air around him grew cold enough to freeze blood, to crack stone. To him, Kael was not just a rogue asset. He was a personal insult, a flaw in his perfect, meticulous design, a grotesque mockery of the biological godhood he had spent a lifetime pursuing.
Valerius had no intention of sending more fodder to their demise. He dispatched his personal guard, the Scions of Ruin. They were not mere hunters. They were his masterpieces, the pinnacle of his art. A woman whose lower body was a churning, graceful vortex of bladed tentacles. A giant of a man whose skin was a living forge, capable of melting steel with a mere touch, his flesh glowing with internal heat. A silent assassin who could phase through solid matter like a phantom, a living ghost of stitched-together shadows. They were demigods of destruction, each a unique testament to Valerius's genius, and their single unified purpose was to retrieve the living stain on their master's legacy. The hunt began anew, but this time it was not a simple search-and-destroy mission. It was a strategic, suffocating encirclement. Kael and Ilara found themselves constantly on the run, the Scions always one step behind, herding them, testing them from a distance, driving them toward a predetermined killing ground. Kael could feel their power, their monstrous essence calling out to his own like a challenge between apex predators. The world had become a hunting ground, and he was the designated prey. The trap was sprung in the skeletal ruins of an old fortress overlooking the dead salt sea, its bones bleaching under a merciless sun. The Scions of Ruin cornered them, cutting off all avenues of escape with terrifying efficiency. Kael, flush with the power he had absorbed from the cleaners, was arrogant. He believed himself untouchable.
He engaged them head-on, a maelstrom of claws, bone blades, and kinetic force that shattered the ancient stones of the fortress. The battle was cataclysmic, but the Scions were a unit, a symphony of destruction, their twisted abilities complementing each other with perfect, deadly harmony. They were a surgeon's scalpel to his sledgehammer. While he fought the living forge and the tentacled fury, a brutal clash of elemental force and biological weaponry, the phantom assassin, wraith-like and utterly silent, slipped past his frenzied defenses. Her target was not his body. Her chilling, ethereal hand phased through his chest, a touch of absolute zero that did no physical damage, but momentarily paralyzed his control over the ascendants, severing him from the source of his power. In that single, stolen, split second of weakness, the other struck. The giant slammed him into the ground with the force of a meteor, melting the very rock around him, trapping him in a molten prison. The woman's tentacles, each tipped with a neurotoxin-laced barb, pierced his body from a dozen angles, flooding his system with a cocktail of agonizing poisons. He was overwhelmed, his regeneration sputtering and failing against the onslaught of specialized toxins and overwhelming coordinated force. He saw them take Ilara. She did not scream, but her eyes, wide with terror and a strange, profound pity for him, were the last thing he saw before the world dissolved into blackness. They left him for dead, a broken, twitching mass of flesh impaled on cooling, molten rock. The pain was absolute, a universe of agony, but it was nothing compared to the crushing, unbearable weight of his failure. His arrogance, his foolish pride had cost him the only person who had ever seen him as more than a monster or a weapon.
As his body slowly, agonizingly began to stitch itself back together, cell by agonizing cell, a cold, hard clarity settled over him, freezing his soul. Doubt was a luxury he could no longer afford. Morality was a chain he had to break. To save Ilara, to face Valerius, he could not just be strong. He had to be perfect. The hunger, the gnawing void he had fought for so long, now felt like an answer. It whispered a simple, seductive truth in the silence of his broken mind. Power is the only thing that cannot be taken from you. His true rebirth was not in fire, but in cold, calculating rage. He dragged his broken body from the rock and began to hunt, not for survival, but for evolution. He was no longer a passive recipient of power. He was a designer, a predator with a purpose. He needed more than just raw essence. He needed traits, adaptations, biological weapons. He tracked a shadow panther, a cursed beast renowned for its ability to blend into the very concept of darkness. And after a tense, silent hunt, he assimilated its chameleonic stealth. He needed more than just raw essence. He needed traits, adaptations, biological weapons. He tracked a shadow panther, a cursed beast renowned for its ability to blend into the very concept of darkness, and after a tense, silent hunt, he assimilated its chameleonic stealth. His skin now shifted and warped, mirroring his surroundings with perfect fidelity, until he was a ghost in the landscape. He sought out a colony of crystal carapaced scorpions, creatures whose exoskeletons could deflect energy blasts and absorbed their biological secrets. Plates of a dark, chitinous armor, harder than any steel, grew over his vital points, flowing and retracting at his will like a second skin. He plunged his arms into the vegetative heart of a grove hydra, a monstrous plant-animal hybrid, and from his back erupted a series of prehensile, vine-like appendages, each tipped with a razor-sharp talon and capable of injecting his own modified, deadly biotoxins. Each assimilation was a conscious step further away from his human form, a deliberate sacrifice of his former self on the altar of vengeance. He shed his humanity like a snakeskin, his features sharpening, his eyes beginning to glow with a faint predatory light. The whispers of the ascendants were no longer a tempting external voice, but the very rhythm of his own heartbeat. He moved across the blighted land not as a man, but as a force of nature, a biological plague vectoring towards the black heart of the Iron Hand Guild. He was coming for Valerius, and he was no longer the sovereign's mistake. He was his judgment. The fortress of warlord Valerius, a spike of black iron and twisted living bioarchitecture thrusting into the polluted sky like a dagger, was considered impregnable. It had never been breached. It was not a fortress. It was a living organism, its walls slowly regenerating, its corridors shifting functioning according to its master's will, its defense systems a legion of bioengineered horrors. For Kael, it was simply a hunting ground. He flowed through the outer defenses like smoke, his assimilated stealth rendering him utterly invisible to sensors and sentries alike. The first alarm was raised when an entire patrol of elite guards was found in a sealed corridor, not dead, but as desiccated, frozen husks, their essence and life force drained to nothing. He moved through the fortress like a disease, a silent one-man apocalypse. He did not fight armies, he dissolved them. He tore through Valerius's vaunted scions of ruin, his new, specifically evolved form countering each of their abilities with terrifying, poetic efficiency. He phased through the assassin's ethereal attacks, his own body now capable of brief moments of intangible density. He shattered the forged giant's molten skin with resonating sonic vibrations that turned his living armor to dust. He tore the tentacled woman apart with his own appendages, his evolved toxins overriding hers, turning her own weapons against her. Finally, he stood before the obsidian doors of the throne room. They did not open for him. They blasted inward, reduced to shrapnel. And there he was, Valerius, rising from his throne, not with anger or fear, but with a look of chilling, possessive pride. Magnificent, the warlord breathed, his voice a low rasp of metal on stone. I knew you had it in you. I saw it, that spark of perfect, bottomless hatred in your eyes when you were just a pathetic little soldier. I chose you, Kael.
I chose you because your will was so weak, so broken. I thought you would be the perfect empty vessel for this power, my power. The betrayal struck Kael deeper than any blade ever could. It was not random. It was not a punishment. It was a calculated, deliberate plan, and he was meant to be the mindless puppet dancing on his creator's strings. The rage that had been simmering within him for so long, the fuel that had driven his every action, finally reached its boiling point and detonated. You did not create a vessel, Kael's voice echoed, no longer human, but a layered chorus of the creatures he had consumed, a symphony of predators. You created a successor. The air between them crackled with immense, compressed power. Two demigods of flesh and will stood on the precipice of their final conflict, and the battle that followed tore the throne room and the very peak of the fortress itself asunder. Valerius was more than a match for Kael's new, evolved form. Years of ruthless self-experimentation had turned him into a biological terror of unparalleled might. His scars pulsed with an inner, sickly light as he unleashed waves of pure, corrosive essence. Blades of obsidian-hard bone erupted from his arms, clashing against Kael's crystalline armor in a shower of sparks. It was a battle of creators, of two beings who could reshape their own bodies into weapons in the blink of an eye. Kael was faster, more adaptive, his evolution a chaotic, unpredictable dance.
But Valerius was more powerful. His control over his own bioalchemy, refined by decades of ruthless, bloody practice. He forced Kael back, pinning him with constructs of hardened flesh and twisted steel, sneering at the efforts of his creation. "You are still just a child playing with a loaded gun," Valerius roared, his own body beginning to swell and distort, the sound of tearing flesh and cracking bone filling the air. "Allow me to show you what true mastery looks like." His flesh tore open, revealing a horrifying new form beneath, a towering monstrosity of grafted muscle, whirring machinery, and dozens of screaming, half-formed faces embedded in his torso, the souls of those he had sacrificed for his power, their silent screams a testament to his profane apotheosis. He was a walking atrocity, a true biological god of his own profane design. Kael was utterly overwhelmed. A single blow from the transformed Valerius sent him crashing through the fortress walls, out into the raging storm that battered the shattered peak. He was battered, his armor cracking, his regeneration slowing under the sheer, relentless force of Valerius' assault. As the warlord prepared a final, overwhelming blast of energy, an attack that would annihilate Kael and half the mountain, Kael was pushed beyond his limits, beyond any strategy or evolution he had planned. The Ascendants, faced with imminent total annihilation, took a desperate, terrifying gamble. Kael's body, on the verge of being obliterated, violently fractured. He did not explode. He dispersed. In an instant, his physical form dissolved into a swarm of thousands, millions of microscopic bioshards, each a sentient fragment of his will, a speck of dust carrying the totality of his consciousness. The storm above the fortress turned from rain to a glittering, swirling cloud of black snow. Valerius paused, his monstrous form confused, his victory blast dissipating into the empty air where Kael had been. Then the horror began. The swarm of bioshards descended, not attacking the fortress, but phasing through its walls, its inhabitants, like a sentient plague. They were everywhere at once. The guards below screamed as the black dust flowed into their bodies through their armor, turning them to statues of dried, crumbling flesh in seconds. The swarm ignored them, flowing ever upwards, drawn to the most potent source of essence in the citadel. It converged on Valerius, who roared and tried to blast it away with waves of energy, but it was like trying to punch smoke. The sentient cloud swirled around him, and then, with a horrifying, silent rush, poured into his body, through his eyes, his mouth, the very pores of his skin. The final, most grotesque invasion began. The shards did not just attack his cells, they reassembled themselves inside his mind, inside the inescapable prison of his own consciousness. Valerius screamed. Kael was there, not as a man, but as a presence, a living network interwoven with his own neurons. He felt his memories being forcibly extracted, sifted through, and consumed. He relived every atrocity, every betrayal, every sacrifice he had ever made. But this time, he felt the pain of his victims through Kael's shared, consuming consciousness. It was a torture beyond physical comprehension, a vivisection of the soul. Kael, from his terrifying vantage point within the warlord's mind, saw it all. He saw the genesis of Project Chimera, the chilling logic behind it. He saw Valerius as a young man, a brilliant but ruthless alchemist, obsessed with transcending the frailties of human limitation. He saw him murder his own mentor to steal his research. He felt the cold, detached satisfaction Valerius experienced with every successful, monstrous creation. He was not just defeating his enemy, he was becoming him, absorbing his life, his knowledge, his very soul. With a final, silent act of will, Kael severed the connection between Valerius's mind and his monstrous body. The towering atrocity outside froze mid-roar, its internal light fading. Then it began to crumble, its complex biology failing without a consciousness to direct it. It dissolved into a river of gray, primordial sludge that poured down the sides of the broken fortress.
The swarm of bioshards flowed out, coalescing in the storm, reforming Kael's body. He stood on the precipice, whole again, the cold rain washing the grime from his newly formed skin. The victory was absolute, but as he felt the vast, chilling knowledge of Valerius settling into the deepest corners of his own mind, a cold dread filled him. This power, the ability to invade and consume a soul from within, was not the power of a man or even a god. It was the power of an ending. And in that moment, he could no longer tell where Kael, the wronged soldier, and where the all-consuming monster truly began. The Iron Hand Guild was shattered. With the death of its sovereign, the Empire's most brutal faction collapsed into chaos, its secrets and atrocities laid bare for its rivals to devour like vultures. Kael had his vengeance. The architects of his suffering were dust. Ilara was freed from the dungeons below, shaken but alive, looking at him now with a mixture of profound gratitude and an even more profound fear. He had won, but standing amidst the ruins of his enemy's legacy, he felt no triumph, only a vast, chilling emptiness. The hunger was sated, for now, but the power thrumming beneath his skin felt less like a gift and more like a curse that had consumed its first host and was now looking for a new world to devour. And then he felt it. Buried deep within the stolen, assimilated memories of Valerius was a final, terrible secret. Valerius's obsession with essence was not merely for power. He was trying to control it because he feared its source. A new awareness opened up to Kael, a sense that stretched beyond the fortress, beyond the Empire, and deep, deep into the planet's core. Something was down there, something ancient, vast, and sentient. The primordial essence, not the diluted energy that flows through living beings, but its origin. A silent, sleeping God at the heart of the world.
His immense surge of power, the cataclysm of his birth, and the consumption of Valerius had been like a thunderclap in its endless slumber. It was stirring. Whispers from Valerius's fragmented memories spoke of a prophecy, a forgotten myth erased from all history. The emergence of a biological anomaly, an ascendant, would herald the awakening of the planet's true master. And another, a hidden player whose bloodline held the key to pacifying or enraging it. Kael looked out from the shattered peak of the fortress, over a broken world he had helped to break still further. He was a harbinger of a biological apocalypse, but perhaps also its only hope. His war for revenge was over, but as he felt the very ground beneath him begin to hum with an ancient and immeasurable power, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his new inhuman core, that the war for existence itself was just beginning.